Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to pick up on a surprising comment piece in the Telegraph from a few weeks ago now, I think, which argues that first past the post is now a barrier to stable governments. Surprising, because the Tory client media may not like the fact that Labour won first past the post in July, but they know that their tribe will eventually relearn the rules of the game and storm back in the future. Or will they? Because there are two main problems with first past the post. The first is that it is unrepresentative. My opposition to the system has been born out of its inherent unfairness. My opposition is essentially a moral one as much as practical. When it comes to a government, my argument is essentially as follows. If we get a crap government, and all countries get crap governments at times, if we get a crap government that does crap things, if it was genuinely supported by a majority of voters, then we have to accept responsibility for the damage caused. It's collectively our fault. If, for example, the last 14 years of Conservative destruction had been supported by the majority of voters, I would still have opposed it, I'd have still argued against it, but I would have to accept that this is what my country was. It would be our fault. But it was never supported by the majority. Not austerity, not the hard Brexit, not even any Brexit by the time people saw what it was going to be like in reality. In the last Parliament, the Tories passed a lot of controversial laws that had no support from other parties, so without a majority of voter representation. If we're going to get stupid governments, can we at least have national responsibility as a country? Make sure governments have to represent a majority of voters, and at least the consequences are on a majority of us. That's my main reason for supporting proportional representation. Yes, it means we're more likely to get decent governments as well, but even when we don't, and we won't always, at least it's our fault as a country when we pick muppets to lead us. But there's a second problem with the system as well, and it's purely practical. It's an objective problem, which has to be acknowledged by both supporters and detractors of the system. And it's a problem which may now have passed a bit of a tipping point in the UK. So I've been opposed to first past the post ever since I really thought about it, which actually wasn't until I was in my late 20s, if I'm honest. But that was a view I had. There is a point being made in this Telegraph article that regardless of views, first past the post just doesn't work in the UK anymore. For example, I would still argue it's a bad system in the United States. Doesn't represent the will of the voting public, yet the system functions because they basically you have a choice of two massive political parties, and that's it. You occasionally get the odd independent, maybe they make enough of an effect somewhere. You've got a choice of Democrats or Republicans, that's it. In the UK, it's not just that we actually have other parties capable of winning a significant share of the vote, but the two largest parties are collectively getting a smaller share of the vote. It's not just a recent thing either. This has been a trend happening over a long time, decades. Plotting the combined share of the vote for Labour and the Conservatives since 1979, which was the first election after my birth, you can see a general trend downwards. There are a couple of times when it blips up. Most recently in 2017, 2019, maybe due to the polarising nature of Brexit. But over time, you've got this trend downwards, with the most recent election having the lowest combined share of the vote in not just the past century, but ever since these two were the two biggest parties. And given that this general trend has been going downwards for half a century at least, there is no reason to suppose it will suddenly reverse. Because first past the post can only realistically work where there are only two credible options. But people have more credible options now. And the more people that believe that, because voter confidence is part of the picture here, the more they're going to vote accordingly, which now makes it very difficult for either Labour or the Conservatives to command large shares of the vote. And I know you'll say, well, hang on a minute, Phil, Labour won this massive majority. Yeah, because Labour were very, very focused on important key voters to the point where they actively pissed off some others. And the Conservatives were utterly woeful on all counts. What happens when we have an election where that's not the case? What happens when we have an election when that's not the case? Very different outcome then. We're going to be into the territory potentially of hung parliaments being standard. Because after this election, with the unprecedented success of parties outside of the top two, the Greens, the Lib Dems, Reform UK, all, have done better than ever before. The genie could well be out the bottle. The reason people do vote for a lot of smaller parties in local elections, but they don't so much in general elections, it's not because they think these smaller parties are brilliant at potholes and bin collections, but maybe not the affairs of state. It's because they believe that those smaller parties can win power in local government, where the votes come down to like a few hundred, but they don't believe they can win seats nationally. Well, it's hard to say that now after this election's results. So the next election and the next few elections could be very interesting. Now, if the next election happens to be one which crystallises around a central theme, then yes, people may flock to the polls of Labour and Conservatives again. There may well be future elections where that combined Labour-Tory vote spikes up again. But for all other elections, ones where the issues are more general, or even, as was the case this year, where voters feel the party they opposed was dead and buried anyway, we're going to see more people voting for other parties. We may even get to a point in the next decade where the number of people voting either Conservative or Labour drops below 50%, because it's not far off right now. And so the point being made in this Telegraph opinion piece is well made. First past the post cannot guarantee stable governments anymore. There are lots of reasons to oppose first past the post and indeed promote the best supported alternative, proportional representation. But many of those other reasons are going to find supporters and detractors. But not many people would support a system which provides unstable governments. Indeed, one of the main oppositions to PR is this belief that, but it leads to unstable governments. It's like, no, it doesn't. I mean, if you've got too many parties and power is split too many ways, then yes, stable coalitions can be hard to maintain as tribal arguments break out, granted. But there are also as many different forms of PR as there are countries which use them. We would just need to use a system which prevents the splintering of politics into too many niche parties. It's possible to develop a system which gives an advantage to fewer larger parties with broader appeal, while still making sure the government represents a majority of voters. If you design a system properly with that remit, it will work, as it does in the vast majority of countries which use PR. Indeed, using a combination of regional PR and additional member top-up based on constituencies would do that. Similar to the system used in the Scottish Parliament, though don't use first past the post for the top-up, that's what I would say. Use an alternative vote system. Consider that both the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments did have a stable alliance when no party won an outright majority, and those alliances only failed very recently, actually this year, as a result of the respective party leaders doing something monumentally stupid. Don't let your leaders do stupid things, and the system works perfectly well for promoting stable government. Just before the election, people may know that Keir Starmer said, first past the post leads to stable government, and everyone hoping for electoral reform went, oh no. But it doesn't seem credible he really believes that. After all, before this last election, when was the most stable government we had? It was between 2010 and 2015, wasn't it? A coalition government. Yes, it was delivered under first past the post, but it could just as easily have resulted from PR. Every government from 2015 onwards has been a pure consequence of first past the post. If we had PR and the same voting breakdown, we wouldn't have got those governments. We had the majority Cameron period, which didn't last very long because Brexit broke it. And remember, he only won that majority because the Lib Dem vote collapsed as a result of Tory policies. Then we had Theresa May, who lost that slender majority and then couldn't even get her own MPs to vote for the party's flagship policy. Then the majority government of 2019, that must have been stable. He got a big majority. Yeah, they burned through 3 leaders inside a single term and passed almost no landmark legislation at all. These were incredibly unstable governments, objectively so. And yet, these governments could only possibly result from first past the post. And although we can look at the current government and say, oh, thank goodness the grown-ups are back in charge, there's nothing inherently stable about this government either. People also say, but if we have PR, then Reform UK will win lots more seats. Yes, they will. And that will actually make the likes of Farage less toxic in many ways, because then they'll have a large enough representation in Parliament to do something. Populism and extremism feed on the idea of being ignored by the establishment. 14% of the people who voted in July for Reform UK only got 1% of the seats in Parliament, and that's me rounding up. It all feeds into the idea of not being listened to. So Farage's toxic rhetoric continues to have power. It's like, all you people voted for us, and yet we only get this tiny amount of influence in Parliament. So he will continue to influence public opinion, and that public opinion will continue to influence the bigger parties who will have to adopt bad policies in order to take account of it. But if people are properly represented, the victim mentality dials down. You know, take the Netherlands, for example, where we wouldn't use their system, by the way. But just as an example, because people try to say, oh, this shows how unstable PR is. It's not unstable. There, Nigel Farage won more seats than anyone else, but didn't get enough for a majority, because not enough people in any country are crazy enough to have to vote for that. So his party formed a coalition which required quite a lot of the crazy to be jettisoned, and Wilders himself is not the Prime Minister. The result is a government which is a representation of the majority of voters. If it ends up being shit, and it probably will, then that's on the voters at least, because they voted for it. But what they didn't get was a government representing extreme narrow interests. PR doesn't promote unstable government, it promotes representative government. But I'll tell you what will be unstable. A first past the post system where the party of government and the main party of opposition combined are only hovering about 50% of the votes cast, and in the near future may dip below it. Because it only even pretends to work if one of those parties has a strong focus on vote targeting and the other is getting their strategy badly wrong. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.